Night enveloped the city in a dense blanket of silence that seemed almost tangible. The streets, paved with old stones, reflected the faint light of the lanterns, casting long shadows. The guardsman walked slowly, his footsteps echoing resoundingly, cutting through the viscous void of the night air. His figure, sturdy and confident, stood out against the flickering lights in the windows of the sleeping houses. But he knew the calm was deceptive. Trouble could lurk around every corner in this city. There was the rumble of an engine behind him, too slow to be accidental. The guardsman stopped and looked back, his eyes fixed on a black and white patrol car, its headlights cutting through the darkness like a knife edge. The car braked beside him, and the door opened with a heavy creak. "Hey, you! Stop!" The policeman's voice was harsh, ragged, and there was a note of command in it that made the guardsman feel uneasy. A man in uniform stepped out of the car, his figure looming against the headlights. He was taller than average, with a square face and a cold stare that smoldered with prejudice and superiority. The street lights glinting on his polished uniform seemed to reinforce his status, making him part of this nightmare. "ID." "Immediately," he said, stepping closer, his hands nervously rubbing the belt with the gun and stun gun hanging from it. The guardsman, realizing that resistance could escalate the situation, slowly pulled out his ID card. His gaze was calm, but a spark of distrust burned in the depths of his eyes. He held out the documents, but the cop stepped closer without even looking at them, the tightening circle of tension seeming to close. "What are you doing here? It's late. You have no business being here." The policeman's voice took on an accusatory tone, as if he'd already decided he was a criminal. "I'm going home," the guardsman replied, trying to keep his voice steady, but there was a cold hardness in it. The cop smirked, his face contorted in a grimace of contempt. He stepped closer, the smell of cheap coffee and cigarettes wafting into the guard's face. "Home? Wasn't that too convenient an excuse? You're too conspicuous for this neighborhood," he hissed, his fingers nervously reaching for the stun gun, as if the very presence of the guardsman irritated him. The guardsman tensed. He felt something in the air change. A faint breeze ruffled his hair, as if warning of an impending storm. "I'm not breaking the law," he said firmly, feeling his heart quicken its rhythm, but his voice remained calm, honed by years of discipline. "We'll see about that." The cop grinned, his hand slowly dropping to the handle of the stun gun. At that moment, time seemed to stand still. The silence was deafening, and the only sound was the beating of his heart, which he could feel even in his temples. "This is no accident," he thought, realizing that this evening would change everything. The policeman lazily accepted the documents, barely glancing at them. His face contorted into a grimace, as if he were holding something dirty. He didn't bother to open the ID card, just glanced at the name in large letters and chuckled. "James Henderson," he said, as if the name were suspicious. "A little too sounding for this neighborhood, isn't it?" The guardsman stood still, his posture straight, but his hands clenched into fists. He felt the policeman's words pierce him like sharpened needles. "That's my last name. What's the problem?" he asked coldly, trying not to let his emotions get the best of him. "The problem is you, kid," the cop said, his voice louder and louder, as if he wanted to attract the attention of passers-by. "It's late, and guys like you don't usually hang around here for no reason." The guardsman felt anger boiling up inside him. The words were not casual, they were hateful. The policeman stepped closer, his voice harsh and insulting. "Maybe you stole something? Or maybe you're dealing. Where do you get the money to buy clothes like that?" "I'm a sergeant in the National Guard," James said firmly, but his words sounded like a challenge. He hoped the rank would stop the cop. However, the man only grinned, a smirk playing across his face, and he leaned a little closer. "Sarge?" Sure. We know how you work on the side. Some of you do nothing but hide behind your uniforms." He threw the papers in James's face, making them fall to the wet pavement. At that moment, the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The guardsman lowered his gaze to his papers lying in the dirt. His body tensed like a taut string, but he stayed where he was. To pick them up was to submit to humiliation, and to leave them behind was to admit defeat. The policeman took a step back, his face a look of smugness. He saw James's internal struggle and enjoyed his supposed power. "What's up, soldier?" The cop snorted. "Where's your discipline?" James gritted his teeth and bent down to pick up the papers. His hands trembled, but he straightened again, looking the policeman straight in the eye. "I didn't break the law," he said slowly, each word like a hammer blow. But that wasn't enough for the cop. He stepped even closer, filling the space between them with his aggression. "The law?" His voice sounded almost like a hiss. "You think anyone's going to protect you here? Far from home, boy. It's not that simple here." There was a threat in his voice. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. The lanterns continued to flicker relentlessly, but their light could not dispel the darkness that had descended on the scene. The guardsman looked him in the eye again. His gaze was filled with rage, held back with the last of his strength. The policeman sensed it, but instead of backing away, he only smirked. His hand rested on the handle of the stun gun. "Put your hands behind your back," he ordered coldly, his voice full of false grandeur. "Let's see how disciplined you are, Sergeant." The crowd gathered around him froze in anticipation. Only the sound of a distant car cut the silence. On the pavement, in the glow of the streetlights, the shadows of the two men merged into an inseparable mass. James didn't move, his hands still free, but every second of silence was like a loud bang. And then, in the heart of this silent war, there was a spark that was ready to ignite a flame. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, whether you or someone you know has had something similar happen to you, and how you dealt with injustice. We want to know what you think. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And now, we continue. The silence snapped like a taut string. The policeman stepped forward, not an inch between him and James. There was an almost animalistic anger in his gaze, a desire to crush this man who hadn't bowed his head. "I said, put your hands behind your back," the cop repeated, his voice sounding like a commanding bark. The guardsman remained standing, his face stony. He had faced threats before, but this was different. This wasn't a war abroad. This was a war on his soil, against a man who was supposed to be upholding the law. "I didn't break the law," James repeated again, his voice low, calm, but it sounded iron. These words seemed to make the policeman even angrier. His hand abruptly pulled the stun gun off his belt. "And I'm the one who decides if you've broken the law or not." He grinned, raising the device so it could be seen by the crowd that now surrounded the stage in a semicircle. Quiet conversations, whispers, and tense anticipation began in the crowd. Some people pulled out their phones, their cameras glinting in the light of the street lamps. But no one intervened. The policeman activated the taser, and a sharp crackle of electricity cut the air. The sound, so short and aggressive, made many in the crowd wince. "Maybe this way you'll realize you're not in charge here," the cop said before the taser whistled across James' body. The discharge pierced the guardsman. His body shuddered, his muscles flexed, and he fell to his knees. But he did not scream. Even in the moment of that excruciating pain, he clenched his teeth, not letting the crowd or the cop see his suffering. "How's that? Feel better?" The policeman grinned, looking down at the guard. The first indignant cries echoed in the crowd. People whispered louder, and a few voices cut through the noise. "That's too much. He's done nothing wrong. Someone has to stop him." But most stayed away, averting their gaze or hiding behind their phone screens. James, struggling to regain his breath, raised his head. His gaze met the policeman's eyes, and there was no fear or brokenness in them, just cold fury. "Is that the best you can do?" he wheezed, his voice hoarse but firm. The policeman turned pale. He had expected submission, a plea for mercy, but instead he received a challenge. His face contorted in a grimace of anger, and he activated the taser again. "You didn't learn the first time," he shouted, bringing the discharge closer to James's body. But before he could strike, a woman's voice came from the crowd. "Stop it! This is too much!" The cop turned around sharply, his eyes darting to the woman speaking. She stood with her phone at the ready, filming everything. Several people in the crowd followed suit, shouting words of protest. "You're already on video. Stop bullying him," shouted a man at the far end of the crowd. The policeman, realizing he had lost control of the situation, froze for a moment. But that was long enough for James. Despite the pain and weakness, he slowly rose from the ground. His body trembled, but his posture remained straight. "You can hit me 100 more times, but you'll never make me break," he said, looking straight into the cop's eyes. That moment was the point of no return. The crowd was no longer silent. Some shouted protests, others filmed what was happening. There was something in the air that the policeman could not control, the power of truth that had finally broken through his violence. But he wasn't ready to give up. He still had the stun gun in his hands and hatred in his heart. This was only the end of the beginning. As the discharge passed through James's body, his muscles twisted in an unnatural arc. His legs buckled, and he fell to the hard, wet asphalt, his hands barely able to cushion the impact. In that instant, time seemed to stop, and all he heard was the resounding echo of his own heart. The crowd around them froze. Only a few phone cameras continued to record what was happening as silent witnesses to the brutality. The policeman stepped forward, his metal-tipped boots clattering loudly on the pavement. He looked down at James with contempt, as if he were not a human being but dirt underfoot. His face was distorted in the streetlight, and his eyes were filled with cold hatred. "That's it. All you've got is a nice uniform and empty words," he said, wiping the sweat from his face. "But there's nothing behind that uniform. You're always the same." James, breathing hard, raised himself up on his elbows. Every movement was hard, pain coursing through every cell in his body. But he looked up, and it was like a blade of steel. There were no tears, no pleading, only unyielding strength. "You can hit me," he said, his voice low, but every word was filled with weight. "But I won't break." The policeman snorted, his face contorted into a smirk. He stepped closer, knelt down, and grabbed James by the collar, pulling his face closer to his own. "You're not going to break?" he hissed. "You're already on your knees. Look at you. You're nothing. You've always been nothing." James remained silent. His breathing was ragged, but he didn't look away. The policeman released him, pushing him back to the ground as if pushing away an unwanted object. "Get up if you can," he said, standing up. "Come on, show everyone how strong you are." Whispers began to break out in the crowd. Someone shouted out, "Leave him alone. Enough." But the cop, without turning around, only raised his hand as if that reprimand was nothing to him. "That's between me and him," he said, his voice sounding like he thought he was doing justice. "Or do you want to try the taser, too?" The crowd was silent, fear enveloping the people, and no one dared to take a step forward. James, meanwhile, rose slowly to his feet. He staggered, his legs shaking, but he stood. His face was covered in sweat and dirt, but his eyes burned. The policeman looked at him with a look of surprise that was quickly replaced by anger. "Look, our hero's back in action," he grinned. "But, it won't be for long." He raised the stun gun again, his fingers trembling with anger. But before he could strike again, James spoke. "You have the power, but you don't have the strength." These words hit the policeman harder than any blow. His face reddened and he stepped forward, activating the taser again. But at that moment there was movement in the crowd. Several people took a step closer. Phones pointed directly at the policeman, and one voice sounded louder than the others. "We're filming the whole thing. It's going on the news." The cop froze, his gaze flicking to the crowd. The realization that he was being watched and his every move was being recorded began to creep into his mind, but he didn't want to back down. "This doesn't concern you," he bellowed, turning back to the crowd, but his voice was no longer so confident. James, still standing, raised his hand, indicating for the men to stop. His gaze was calm, but there was a hurricane raging inside. "They're not afraid of you," he said, looking straight into the cop's eyes. "Neither am I." The policeman squeezed the stun gun harder, but something in his eyes changed. For the first time that night, he felt control slipping away from him. It was a moment when everything around him could either explode or calm down, but everyone standing there knew this night would be remembered forever. James lay on the ground, his face pressed against the cold asphalt, soaked with moisture and dirt. Pain pulsed through his body, every movement stinging in his muscles. But he knew that to stay there was to let not only this man win, but the entire system he represented. The crowd around froze, watching the scene. At its center was the man who was being broken, and the one who wanted to prove his supposed superiority. The policeman stood over James, his breathing ragged but still holding the stun gun as a symbol of power. "Get up if you can," the cop said, his voice loud, almost theatrical. He was speaking not so much to James as to the crowd, as if he wanted to show his strength. "Come on, show me you're worth something." James raised his head slowly. His face was haggard, covered in dirt and sweat, but there was a steadfastness in his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst and wasn't about to give up in the face of it. He leaned on his hands, his fingers slipping on the wet pavement, but he kept climbing, inch by inch. Every movement was a struggle. His legs shook, his muscles burned, but he kept going anyway. When he finally rose to his knees, the crowd around him sighed as if it were one huge chest. The policeman frowned, his smugness beginning to give way to irritation. "What are you trying to prove?" he barked, taking a step closer. "You think this is going to change anything? You think any of them will take your side?" His words sounded like venom, each syllable an attempt to prick, to make James fall back. But the man continued on. Another tug, and he was standing. His figure towered, albeit with difficulty, but with unyielding pride. "It's not about them," James said quietly, his voice hoarse but firm. "It's about me." The policeman froze for a moment. The words were not what he had expected to hear. They were a challenge, direct and uncompromising. "You're kidding." The cop stepped even closer, his face turning crimson. "Nobody wants you. People like you always stay at the bottom. You can pretend you're above, but you know it's a lie." Those words hit James like punches from fists. But he didn't flinch. His shoulders remained straight, and his gaze was fixed on the cop's face. There was something in that look that made the silent crowd murmur. "You talk about me, but look at you," James said, his voice louder, penetrating the silence. "Your power is only your badge and your weapon. Without them, you're nothing." Those words cut through the cop's smugness like a knife. His hand gripped the stun gun even tighter, but he didn't move. The crowd began to move closer, some people shouting, "Leave him alone. He's already proven you wrong." But the cop didn't want to give up his position. His face contorted in a grimace of hatred, and he raised the stun gun again, but his hand froze. James wasn't the only one standing in front of him now. The crowd, dozens of eyes, were staring right at him. "Do you think they'll help you?" He threw, but his voice was no longer as confident as before. "These people will turn away as soon as you fall. They like to watch, but they won't do anything." "It's not about them," James said again, his voice as hard as steel. "It's about me." The words echoed through the crowd. People kept filming, and some began to move closer. The fear that had seemed unshakable began to crack at the seams. The policeman took a step back. It was a barely noticeable movement, but everyone saw it. The crowd started shouting louder, phones were pointed at him. He was the center of attention, and now that attention was binding him like chains. James took a step forward. Despite the pain, despite the humiliation, he stood, and every step he took was a challenge. This was his battle, and he was already winning. The air was saturated with tension that seemed to be physically palpable. The crowd, which had hitherto watched in silence, began to move. The first shouts grew louder, and two groups began to distinguish themselves among the voices. "He deserved it," shouted the man in the baseball cap, his face twisted with anger. "The police know what they're doing. If they stop someone like that, there's a reason for it." "This is madness," the woman next to him objected, her voice as sharp as a whip. "He has done nothing. This is pure injustice." People began to argue among themselves, their faces a mixture of anger, fear, and uncertainty. The phone cameras were still pointed at the stage, but now their own conflict was playing out behind the scenes. The policeman, sensing this crack in the crowd, turned to the group supporting him. "There, see?" he shouted, pointing at James. "People like him are nothing but troublemakers. He's been in hot spots. So what? He's no better than any street criminal here." The words, filled with venom, came out of his mouth like a weapon designed for destruction. James, who was standing still, looked straight at him, his gaze still hard, but inside he could feel the atmosphere growing more and more dangerous. The noise of the crowd became deafening. People were shouting, interrupting each other, some threatening, others trying to calm them down. But suddenly, as if out of nowhere, several more figures in police uniforms appeared in the crowd. "What's going on here?" One of the new arrivals, a tall man with a stern face, asked loudly. His voice was commanding, and the crowd quieted a little, but not for long. "This man refuses to comply," the cop, who was already in the center of the conflict, reported quickly. His face glowed with a mixture of fear and aggression. "He is resisting arrest." "Lies," shouted a woman in the crowd, picking up her cell phone. "It's all on camera. This man has done nothing." One of the new police officers nodded briefly and looked at the crowd, then at James, who stood unmoving. "You're under arrest for disobeying a police officer," he said, stepping forward, his hand reaching for the handcuffs. "It's not submission. It's defending your dignity," James replied calmly, but his words only ignited a new round of tension. The policemen surrounded him, their movements fast and coordinated. The crowd started shouting again. People tried to get closer, but they were pushed back. "You can't arrest him," the young man shouted, his voice full of rage. "This is an abuse of power. Put the phones away," one of the policemen ordered sharply, his voice the loudest. "It's interfering with the investigation." But people didn't put their phones away. They kept filming, shouting words of encouragement to James. One even tried to get closer, but was stopped by another policeman. James looked again at the cop who had started it all. Their gazes met, and in that clash of eyes was their entire conflict. James saw fear behind the mask of aggression. The cop, on the other hand, saw in James what he wanted to destroy a power he couldn't control. "You can shackle me, but you won't silence me," James said. His voice was firm, but you could hear the weariness in it. These words caused an explosion of emotions in the crowd. People started shouting words of protest. Some tried to push towards the police officers, and some just watched, frozen with fear. But before anyone could do anything else, sirens wailed in the distance. It was a signal that the situation was about to get out of control. The police knew they had to act quickly, but the crowd seemed ready to break at any second. James stood in the center of all this chaos, his figure as still as a rock in the midst of the raging ocean. He knew this wasn't the end. This was just another round of a battle that was bigger than himself. Let's pause for one more brief pause. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, whether something similar happened to you or someone you know, and how you dealt with injustice. We want to know what you think. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this story. And now we continue. The air felt heavy, as if the whole city was holding its breath. The crowd continued to rumble, the shouts and arguments growing louder. But in the center of all this chaos, James remained motionless. His body ached, every muscle burning with tension, but he stood, realizing that every movement he made was not only his own personal struggle, but a symbol of resistance to something greater. The policeman who had started it all was standing opposite him, his face tense, but there was something new in his eyes, a mixture of anger and fear. He realized that the situation was out of control. James no longer looked like a man who could be broken, and the crowd was growing bolder, their shouts turning into words of encouragement. "I said, put your hands behind your back," the cop shouted again, trying to regain control of the situation. His voice was full of rage, but it sounded like he was trying to convince himself, not the people around him. James took a step forward. His movements were slow, but each step was full of meaning. He wasn't submissive, but he wasn't aggressive either. It was a silence that could shout louder than any words. "I have done nothing wrong," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise of the crowd like a knife. "I am not a criminal, and I will not obey unjust orders." These words, like a spark, triggered a new wave of emotion in the crowd. People began to shout, "He's right, leave him alone. It's not fair." The policemen who had surrounded James looked at each other. One of them seemed to want to say something but remained silent, looking back at the crowd. The head cop stepped forward, his hand reaching for the handcuffs again. "Do you refuse to obey?" he asked, his voice as cold as ice. "This is your last chance. Either you follow my orders, or I'll have you arrested." James looked straight into his eyes. It was the look of a man who had already been through the worst and knew he couldn't be broken. "Arrest me if you want," he said, his voice calm, but there was steel behind it. "But know this, I'm not the one losing my honor. It is you who are losing it." The words struck like a hammer. The head cop stepped closer, his face red with anger. He raised a hand to grab James's shoulder, but he didn't back down. His posture, his gaze, even his silence, it was all a challenge. The crowd began to move again. The people moved closer, their shouts growing louder. Someone shouted, "We can see everything. This is an abuse of power." The policeman holding the handcuffs froze. It was clear to him that everything was being recorded. The phone cameras were catching every gesture, every word, every emotion. Any rash action could be another blow to their already shaky authority. "We can't let this go on," one of the police officers said quietly, his voice almost inaudible over the noise of the crowd. "This doesn't look like a routine arrest anymore." But the head cop wasn't listening. He was too absorbed in his anger, his hand reaching for the stun gun again. "You asked for it," he hissed, activating the device. At that moment, something changed. The crowd that had been watching suddenly began to move forward. Several people broke through the chain of cops, standing between the cop and James. The woman with the phone pointed the camera directly at the head cop's face. "Enough!" she shouted, her voice trembling but with determination. "We won't let you do this." James stayed where he was. He didn't try to hide behind the men who were now his protectors. He just stood, his gaze remaining fixed on the cop, who now looked confused. "Stand down!" shouted the head cop, his voice tense but no longer so confident. "You're obstructing justice." "That's not justice," James replied, his voice firm but calm. "It's an abuse of power." His words seemed to be the final blow. The head cop backed away, his face a mixture of anger and defeat. The cops standing nearby began to look around, clearly unsure of what to do next. The sirens that had been approaching all this time finally became deafening. New police cars pulled up to the scene and officers began to get out of them. The crowd grew even more animated, but James didn't move. He knew he had done everything he could, and now this battle was beyond his control. This was a clash that could not end quietly. It was the beginning of something bigger. The crowd continued to gather like waves around a lonely cliff. People passing by stopped to see what was going on. Some whispered among themselves, while others immediately pulled out their phones, turned on their cameras, and started filming, streaming the video live. Faces were tense, voices grew louder, and the air around them seemed saturated with anxiety. James stood, his body taut as a string, his muscles aching, but he didn't let it show. His face remained calm, though a storm was raging inside. The policeman who had started it all was standing across the street, his hand still clutching the stun gun. He looked around, seeing the phones in people's hands recording his every move. "Put the cameras away," he ordered sharply. His voice was hoarse, but it was no longer as confident as it had been before. "This is an official police operation." But no one put their phones away. The crowd grew bolder and bolder, and some began to shout, "We see everything you do. Leave him alone. This is too much." The anger in the voices of the people was growing by the second. Someone shouted from the middle of the crowd, He's just trying to protect himself, and you're acting like animals." The policeman turned to the crowd, his face twisted with anger. "This is none of your business," he shouted. "Step back, or I'll have you all arrested." These words only fueled the fire. People began to move closer, their voices louder, but no one dared to make the first move. James, who had been standing still, felt the weight of the moment intensify. He could see that the police officers who were surrounding him were beginning to get nervous. Some of them were looking at each other as if they were not sure what to do next. "It won't end for you just like that," shouted a young girl with a phone, holding it high to capture everything that was happening. "We will show this to everyone, and you will be held accountable for your actions." Angry shouts from the crowd intermingled with cries of compassion. Several people began to beg the police to stop this madness. "Leave him alone. He didn't do anything wrong. Why are you doing this? He's a soldier." But the cops, as if hearing nothing, continued to stand there clutching their guns and handcuffs. The head cop still seemed to be trying to keep the situation under control, though his gaze betrayed confusion. "We're doing our job," he shouted, looking back at the crowd. "You don't understand the big picture." "What painting?" shouted a man from the front row, his face red with anger. "All we see is you mocking a human being." The crowd began to move closer, and the tension became almost unbearable. One of the policemen took a step back, his hand instinctively resting on his holster, which only added to the anxiety. "Don't do it!" A woman with a child in her arms screamed, her voice trembling with fear. James watched, his heart pounding in his chest. He realized that the crowd was on the verge of exploding, and if it did, things might not go the way he wanted them to. He raised his hand again, gesturing for people to stop. "Don't give in to their provocations," he said loudly, his voice firm but calm. "They want you to lose your temper. Don't let them." His words quieted the crowd for a moment. Some people stopped, but their eyes remained fixed on the policeman. The head cop stepped closer to James, his face stony. "You think these people will protect you?" he hissed, his voice low but full of venom. "No one will come between you and the law." "It's not a law," James replied, his eyes glittering. "It's tyranny." These words again caused a wave of emotion in the crowd. People began to shout louder, some moving forward, others shouting threats. The police officers began to look around nervously, clearly realizing that control was slipping away. And then there was a sound that cut through all the chaos, the sound of another siren. Another police car pulled up to the scene, but this time a uniformed man with a higher rank stepped out of it. His face was focused, but it didn't have the aggression that the head cop had. "What's going on here?" he asked loudly, looking at the gathered crowd. The situation froze for a moment. The people fell silent. The police officers looked at each other, but James remained standing where he was, his gaze unwavering. In that moment, he realized that this wasn't just his fight. It was a moment of truth for everyone who had witnessed this injustice. The siren echoed in the tense silence. The policeman with the higher rank looked around carefully, his gaze shifting from the crowd to James, who stood straight, despite the shaking in his legs and the ache in his body. The air was taut as a string, and even the whispers in the crowd were louder than usual. The head cop took a step forward, clearly trying to regain control. His voice echoed over the heads of the men. "This is a routine detention. No one here sees the whole picture. You're filming the wrong thing. This man is refusing to comply, and that's breaking the law." His words, however, no longer resonated. People looked at him in disbelief, and many continued to record what was happening. Someone shouted from the crowd, "We see everything! Stop lying!" James took a deep breath. Pain pierced his ribs, but he didn't flinch. He knew this was the moment in which to speak, not to himself, but to everyone watching. His voice was low, but it sounded loud as a bell in the silence. "I'm not standing here because I'm guilty. I'm standing here because you want to make me feel guilty for who I am." The crowd froze. It was as if the words had swallowed up the noise and shouting. All eyes turned to James. Even those who had previously argued about the propriety of the police were now listening. "You don't want the truth," he continued, his voice rising with each word. "All you want is your superiority. You see a man with a different skin, a different story, and that's enough for you." The head cop gritted his teeth, his hand reaching for the stun gun again, but he stopped. The crowd was too close. The cameras had seen too much. "Enough of this nonsense," he shouted, but his voice sounded uncertain. James didn't back down. His eyes, tired, hurt, and angry, were fixed on the cop's face. "You call that a law?" He continued. "The law is protection. Law is justice. And what do? You abuse your power, humiliate, and suppress because you can." The crowd began to whisper, and someone shouted out, "Yes, he's right. This isn't about the law, it's about you," James said loudly, his voice sounding as if it contained the pain and rage of generations. "It's about your fear of losing your power, your fear of seeing us as equals." The head cop took a step back, his face turning white. The other cops looked tense, but no one dared to intervene. The high-ranking cop raised his hand as if to call for silence, but the crowd didn't stop. "I served this country," James said loudly, turning to the crowd. "I protected it, even when it didn't protect me. But I will not let her destroy my dignity." His words, like hammer blows, echoed in people's hearts. The camera phones trembled in their hands, but no one put them away. The crowd held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The head cop took another step back. His confidence was crumbling before his eyes. "Shut up," he shouted, but his voice was weak, almost hoarse. "This is not a court of law, and you have no right to speak." "No, it's a judgment," James answered, turning to face him. "A judgment of the people on your system." The crowd exploded with applause and shouts. People shouted words of encouragement. Some shouted slogans about justice. The head cop froze, his gaze darting between James and the crowd. He could see that control was slipping away. "This is going to end badly for you," he hissed, but the words sounded more like a threat than an order. "It's been bad for us for a long time," James answered, his voice firm. "But that doesn't mean we're going to keep quiet." These words were the climax. The crowd shouted even louder. People moved forward, their faces expressing determination. The high-ranking cop raised his hand, as if he were going to stop his subordinate's actions, but it was too late. The top cop lowered his gaze, realizing he had lost. It was a moment when something changed, not just in this place, but perhaps beyond. It was a moment when one man's voice became louder than all the injustice around him. The next morning, everyone knew about the incident. Witness videos flooded social media, shared, and commented on. Television news opened up the case like a boil, spilling out the accumulated pain and injustice. The faces of James, the top cop, and the crowds of people captured on video became symbols of a system that was tearing apart before our eyes. James woke up in his small apartment, his body still aching. He struggled to get up, every step heavy in his legs, but the physical pain was nothing compared to what he felt inside. Those looks, those words penetrating him like knives, it all stayed with him. He couldn't forget the way they had brought him to his knees, the way they had tried to strip him of his dignity. His phone was ringing off the hook. Journalists, public figures, activists, everyone wanted to hear his story, to know how he had survived the horror. But James didn't feel like a hero. He saw himself as a man who simply stood up for the truth because he could not do otherwise. Meanwhile, the head cop was at the center of public condemnation. His face was all over the screens, his words were quoted, each one sounding like a judgment. The authorities launched an investigation, trying to distance themselves from the scandal, but it was clear. What had happened was not just an accident. It was part of a deeply entrenched system that had finally cracked. But was it enough? People argued. Some demanded justice for James, while others tried to justify the cop's actions, claiming that he was just doing his job. These arguments did not subside. They blazed on social media, in the streets, in offices, and schools. James became a symbol of division and unity at the same time. The policeman who started it all was suspended. His name had become a household name, associated with injustice and abuse of power. But James knew the system didn't give up so easily. He saw it in the eyes of the other police officers that night. They weren't ready to change anything. They were just waiting for the storm to subside. A few weeks later, James went to a rally. The crowd welcomed him with applause, but inside he felt only heaviness. His words on stage were simple, but each one hit the mark. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I'm just a man who wants to live in a world where we are judged by our actions, not by the color of our skin." His voice shook, but he continued. "It's not just my struggle. It's our struggle. And if you want change, you have to be part of that change." These words, recorded by hundreds of cameras, have become another symbol. They have spread around the world, inspiring some and enraging others. But for James, the struggle was not over. Every night he fell asleep with images of that night. Every look, every word, every taser blow stayed with him. His body was healing, but his soul bore scars that could not be seen. The policeman against whom the investigation was launched never admitted his guilt. He said that he had acted within the law, that the situation had been provoked. But his face is now forever associated with that night, with the pain and humiliation he caused. James continued to live, but his life had changed. He became a symbol, but it was hard for him to carry that weight. Sometimes he wanted to just disappear, to get away from the cameras, from the questions, from the memories. But he knew that if he did that, he would deprive many people of hope. This case was not just an episode, but a lesson for everyone. It showed how deep the problem is, how difficult it is to eradicate. But it also showed that one person's resilience can be the spark for change. And while James never wanted to be that spark, he knew his choice that night was the right one. He hadn't broken, and that was his victory. Write in the comments what you think about this story. What feelings did it evoke in you? Have you ever experienced racism, injustice, or prejudice in your life? Tell us how you dealt with these situations. Perhaps your experience will be an encouragement to others, because these conversations help us to understand each other better and to strive for change together. We are truly grateful to each of you for listening and sharing your thoughts. Your comments and support inspire us to create new stories that make us think, experience, and discuss important topics. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next episodes. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a like. That way, we know we're moving in the right direction. Thank you for being with us. We wish you a good day and the strength to stay true to yourself in any situation.